Welcome once again. I'm Dr. William Lester, coming to you as always from the studio of Blackwater Media in the great city of Atlanta. This time around, we'll explore the mystery surrounding a strange creature that haunts the woodlands, mountain ranges, forests, and jungles across the globe. A strange beast, sometimes frightening, but always timid. Many Native Americans refer to it as the hairy giant, which when anglicized is pronounced Sasquatch. And therefore I welcome you to explore Blackwater Media's Bigfoot Files. Imagine you're navigating the dense, humid swamps of Florida. The air is thick with the scent of decaying vegetation, and the only sounds are the distant calls of wildlife. Suddenly, an overpowering stench assaults your senses, a nauseating blend of rotten eggs and skunk spray. Through the mist, a towering, hairy figure moves swiftly among the cypress trees. You've just encountered Florida's elusive cryptid, the skunk ape. The skunk ape, often referred to as Florida's Bigfoot, is described as a bipedal creature standing between 5 to 7 feet tall and covered in mottled reddish-brown hair. Its most distinguishing feature is the foul odor that accompanies it, likened to a mix of wet dog, skunk, and rotting eggs. This pungent smell has led to its evocative name. The creature is said to inhabit the swamps and forests of the southeastern United States, with the Florida Everglades being its primary domain. Reports of the skunk ape date back to the early 19th century. In 1818, local newspapers from what is now Apalachicola, Florida, recounted tales of a man-sized monkey raiding food stores and stalking fishermen along the shore. Indigenous Seminole and Miccosukee tribes also speak of a foul-smelling, powerful creature known as Este Kapkaki, translating to furry tall man or hairy giant. The mid-20th century saw a surge in sightings. In 1942, a man in Suwannee County reported a creature rushing out from the brush, grabbing onto his vehicle and beating on the door for a half mile before retreating. The 1950s through the 1970s were rife with encounters, particularly in Broward County, where multiple eyewitnesses reported nocturnal meetings with a 5 to 7 foot ape-like creature with dark red to black fur. These events were heavily covered in newspapers, both local and in other Florida cities such as Miami, and were some of the earliest instances popularizing the term skunk ape in the state lexicon. In 2000, the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office received 2 anonymous photographs depicting a large, hairy, ape-like creature. The author of the letter claimed to be an elderly woman who reported the creature had been stealing apples from her back porch near I-75, and upon surprising it with a camera, she was afraid it was an escaped orangutan that might harm her family. The scrutinized photos, dubbed the Mayaka skunk ape, remain a polarizing topic, with debates over their authenticity ongoing. While tales of the skunk ape are captivating, many skeptics attribute sightings to misidentified wildlife, particularly the Florida black bear, possibly suffering from mange. The United States National Park Service considers the skunk ape to be a hoax, and no concrete evidence, such as DNA or skeletal remains, has been found to substantiate its existence. That being said, the volume of information gathered on sightings and encounters over the years is more than compelling. Despite the lack of scientific validation, the skunk ape has become an integral part of Florida's cultural tapestry. It features in local legends, stories, and even children's books. Merchandise bearing its image is popular among tourists, and the skunk ape research headquarters in Okeechobee serves as a museum dedicated to the creature. Festivals and events celebrating the skunk ape are held annually in some Florida towns, highlighting its significance in local folklore. Sightings continue into the present day with reports from various counties across Florida. In 2021, there were reported sightings in Martin and Citrus counties. Dave Sheely, founder of the Skunk Ape Research Headquarters, insists the creature's existence has never been disproven, referencing a viral video he took in 2000. He suggests areas near the I-4 and I-95 intersection as hotspots for skunk ape activity. The legend of the skunk ape straddles the line between myth and reality, captivating the imaginations of locals and visitors alike. Whether a misidentified animal, a clever hoax, or an undiscovered species, the skunk ape remains a mysterious and enduring figure in Florida's folklore. As a paranormal investigator, writer, and anthropologist, I find that such legends, regardless of their veracity, offer a fascinating glimpse into the cultural psyche and the human penchant for mystery. And then there is always the potential for a groundbreaking discovery. It's not entirely uncommon for soldiers returning from war to come home with reports of seeing a monster. Throughout history, there have been countless wartime monster sightings. But one sighting in particular, or more accurately, multiple sightings of the same creature, seems to have been more documented than most. I refer specifically to the rock apes of Vietnam. Rock ape is the name given to creatures allegedly spotted by multiple American soldiers during the Vietnam War. However, even prior to the war, stories floated around of jungle people. These jungle people were bipedal and ape-like, standing about 6 feet tall. They were stoutly built and very muscular, but had protruding stomachs. Like many unknown ape-like creatures, they were also covered in hair, either brown or black, with the exception of their knees, the soles of their feet and hands, and their faces, which were all hairless. The jungle people tended to live in more isolated, remote areas of the jungle, keeping to themselves. However, if a human made the unfortunate mistake of crossing their path, they would become bold and aggressive, and would not have any hesitation in attacking the unlucky intruder. The jungle people were at their most active at dusk or during the night, and if they traveled, they would do so in packs. This fact would explain some aspects of the sightings later reported by American soldiers. The most prominent accounts of rock apes were published in Craig P.J. Jorgensen's book, Very Crazy GI, Strange but True Stories of the Vietnam War. One such story from this book tells the account of a unit of 6 men from the 101st Airborne Division. This particular unit was taking a rest when the trees about 15 yards uphill from them suddenly began to shake violently. Naturally, given their environment, the soldiers assumed the shaking was caused by the enemy and that they needed to immediately prepare to be under attack. However, as the soldiers watched the trees, they saw that an oblong head with a face covered in reddish hair, possessing a huge mouth and dark, deep-set eyes had emerged from the brush. This account was also documented in an article by Brent Swanser, The Mysterious Rock Apes of the Vietnam War. When this bizarre creature fully emerged, the soldiers were able to get a better look, and they saw that it was about 5 feet tall and very muscular, and covered in matted reddish hair. The creature stood on 2 legs and examined the soldiers just as they examined it. As the soldiers argued over whether or not the creature might be an orangutan, it retreated back into the jungle. Another incident occurred in 1966 in a location known as Hill 868 in Khe Nam Province, the home of several rock ape sightings throughout the war. In this account, a Marine unit was reporting to their captain that they had spotted movement in the brush, which they assumed was being caused by Viet Cong. The captain told his unit over the radio not to fire. Not long after, the unit reported back that rather than Viet Cong, they were being surrounded by hairy bipedal humanoid creatures. The captain told the unit that rather than firing on the creatures, they should instead throw rocks. However, this backfired as the creatures began throwing the rocks back at them. At this point, the Marines guessed there were hundreds of these creatures, far too overwhelming an amount to stick with their current plan. The Marines were told to change tactics and use their bayonets to fight the creatures. Soon after the order was given, the captain heard over the radio what sounded to him like an epic battle. Afterward, men were sent out to investigate. The location was covered with injured, but not dead, Marines, as might be expected, but also allegedly the bodies of several rock apes. This became known as the Battle of Dong Din, though the only evidence of the event and the dead rock ape bodies littering the battlefield seemed to be the eyewitness accounts, as with most alleged cryptid sightings. Yet another account comes from an unnamed GI. This man gives a description of the rock ape he encountered, which, like the other accounts, was recorded in Jorgensen's book. The GI described it as having an oblong head framed with a hair-covered face. Dark, deep-set eyes lay beneath a prominent brow, and they did nothing to complement the heavy jowls and angry mouth. In 1974, Professor Vo Quai of the Vietnam National University led a North Vietnamese scientific expedition. The expedition found prints that were described as wider than a human print, but too large to be that of an ape. What makes the recorded sightings of rock apes unique is that these accounts are generally published in books about the Vietnam conflict that feature veterans recounting their experiences, and not in books that focus on cryptozoology. Perhaps this is why most rock ape theories consider natural explanations rather than cryptozoological ones. The most common theory is that the soldiers actually saw Tonkin snub-nosed monkeys. However, these monkeys do not come near the fitting descriptions given by the witnesses. Other suggestions for misidentified animals are gibbons or giant orangutans. Of course, given the mysteriousness of the creatures sighted, more unusual explanations have been given. Some have suggested that rock apes could be a surviving population of hominids, or early ancestors of humans, or even a surviving population of Gigantopithecus. Others have suggested that they are an undiscovered species of primate. And finally, given the place and time in which the sightings happened, it's probably not surprising that some have speculated the soldiers who experienced the encounters might have been under the influence of LSD. Frankly, I find this the least credible explanation of all. So, what are the rock apes of Vietnam? We'll probably never know for sure. For now, much like with Bigfoot and other bipedal ape-like cryptids, all we really have to go on is the accounts of the returning soldiers and a handful of footprint casts. On July 19, 1972, a 20-man search party was organized in the small town of Louisiana, Missouri, to track down a huge, black, hairy beast that was being reported by local residents. Louisiana's police chief Shelby Ward was afraid that nervous residents would start shooting the monster and hit a local by mistake. The media whipped up the frenzy about the monster, and the quiet, unassuming community was launched into the national spotlight. The press humorously dubbed the reportedly foul-smelling creature Momo, which stood for the Missouri Monster. But local residents found the frightening encounters anything but funny. The Missouri Monster Scare actually began on July 11, 1972. The first encounter with the creature occurred on the outskirts of Louisiana, at the base of Marzolf Hill. An 8-year-old boy named Terry Harrison and his brother Wiley, age 5, were playing with their dog in the woods at the edge of their yard. Suddenly, an older sister, Doris, 15, who was inside of the house, heard them screaming. She ran to look out of the bathroom window and saw something standing by a tree. It was 6 or 7 feet tall, black and hairy, she said. It stood like a man, but it didn't look like one to me. She began crying and ran into the other room to call her mother on the telephone. Both Doris and Terry got a good look at the monster, and agreed that its face could not be seen because of the mass of hair that covered its body. The creature seemed to have no neck, and it was flecked with blood, likely from the dead dog that it was carrying under its arm. The smell of the creature was said to have been horrendous, and it may have been this odor that made the Harrison's dog violently sick a short time after the incident. The dog's eyes grew red, and it vomited for hours afterward. At 4 p.m., Edgar Harrison, the children's father, and a deacon in the local Pentecostal church returned home from his job at the town waterworks. He found no monster, but he did find that the brush was beaten down where the children said that the creature had been standing. He also found a few faint footprints in the dust and a few black hairs scattered about. That same afternoon, a woman who lived about 3 blocks away from the Harrisons, Mrs. Clarence Lee, reported that she heard animal sounds outside her home. Not long afterwards, she allegedly spoke with a local farmer whose dog had disappeared. Remembering the Harrisons' children's report, she wondered if the monster had taken it. On July 14th, Edgar Harrison was conducting a regular prayer meeting at his home, and soon after it ended, heard clanging sounds like someone was throwing rocks into the metal water reservoir on the top of Marzoff Hill. The reservoir was an attraction for neighborhood children, but it was unlikely that any of them would have been playing there at that hour. As he listened closely to the sounds, he heard one especially loud ring and then an animal-like growl. The sound came closer and closer and was so loud that his family came running out of the house. They urged him to leave the neighborhood, but Harrison wanted to see what was making the sound. Finally, he agreed to leave, and as he drove down Allen Street, he met about 40 people, some of them carrying guns, who were on their way to investigate the sounds at the reservoir. For some reason, Harrison shouted, "Here it comes!" and the entire crowd turned away and ran. A number of people reported hearing the strange cries and screams that night, but by the time the police officers Jerry Floyd and John Whitaker arrived on the scene to investigate, they found nothing out of the ordinary. The creature continued to be seen in the days that followed, leading to Chief Ward's, quote, monster hunt on July 19th. The posse included Edgar Harrison and State Conservation Officer Gus Artis, and they covered Marzoff Hill and the surrounding area using two-way radios, but found nothing. While it was taking place, residents reported animal sounds in other parts of town. On July 20th, more investigators joined the search and again combed the area behind the Harrison house and all along Marzoff Hill. They found trampled brush, signs of digging, and large tracks that were more than 10 inches long. Handprints were found pressed into the dry, hard soil, which investigators were convinced it would have taken immense pressure to make. They also smelled the beast, believing that it was close, but saw nothing. On July 21st, the monster was seen again, this time on the Great River Road, which runs along the Mississippi River. Ellis Minor, who lived on the road, was sitting in front of his home late in the evening. It was very dark, and suddenly his bird dog began to growl. Minor switched on a powerful flashlight that he used for hunting, and he spotted the monster about 20 feet away from him, standing in the middle of the road. He later told reporters that it had hair as black as coal, and that he could not see its face because the hair on its head hung down to its chest. As soon as I threw the light on it, he recalled, it whirled and took off that way. He did not report the sighting to the police, but he did call Gus Artis, the local conservation officer. By now, national publicity was turning Louisiana into a three-ring circus. People were driving in from surrounding states, hoping to get a look at the creature. Edgar Harrison had become obsessed with finding a solution to the monster mystery. His family refused to come home again, taking up residence in a restaurant the family owned, and so his house was turned into a monster outpost. The phones rang constantly. Meanwhile, Harrison had taken a leave of absence from his job at the waterworks to hunt the monster full time. In the company of friends and investigators, he camped out at the foot of Marzoff Hill for 21 straight nights. And while he never saw the monster, he did hear and smell it, and noted that whenever the searchers were onto something, they were overwhelmed by the terrible smell. During the last week of July and into the early days of August, more prints were found south of town. More tracks were discovered on the early morning of August 3rd at the farm of Mr. and Mrs. Bill Sutterth, who lived just northwest of town. In the middle of the night, they heard high-pitched howling in their yard and ran outside with flashlights to see what was going on. In the middle of their garden, they found 4 large prints. Sutterth quickly called his hunting buddy, Clyde Penrod, who drove over and made a plaster cast of the print. Penrod, who was an avid outdoorsman, was puzzled by the whole affair. With the tracks being 20 feet away from anything else, he couldn't understand how they could have been made. They began abruptly in the center of the garden and ended just as mysteriously. It looked as if the creature had just appeared in the center of the garden and then vanished. No tracks were found anywhere else on the property, and there was no sign that any prankster could have made them either. This was to be the last encounter with the creature, and perhaps it is fitting that the monster flap ended on such an inexplicable note. The discovery of the strange tracks at the Sutterth farm ended the Momo sightings and encounters in Louisiana, and the story has become little more than a remembered curiosity in the area today. There are some, though, who are likely to never forget the summer of 1972. For those people, and for those with an interest in the unexplained, those days in July will always remain a mystery.
Here in this primitive river-bottom wilderness in southern Arkansas, along with deer, duck, crane, and beaver, lurks a creature that walks upright. Whether it is a man, a monster, or a myth, no one really knows. What we do know is the people around Fouke, Arkansas say they have seen such a creature nearly 250 times since 1954. And that this creature, whatever it is, emits one of the most terrifying sounds ever recorded. Legend of Boggy Creek, rated G.
The telling of scary stories around a campfire is a tradition that is likely nearly as old as mankind itself. While tales of ghosts, goblins, and murderous psychopaths can rattle the cage of nearly anyone, what better subject for a campfire story could there be than a cannibalistic and murderous Sasquatch? The story of a haunted house might be creepy, but unless you're actually staying in the house in question, it is easily and quickly forgotten once the marshmallows and chocolate and graham crackers appear at the fire. Tales of a creature many people regard as being real, stalking the very woods in which you've pitched your tent, however, are not always so easy to put aside. One such terrifying tale is the story of a Bigfoot war that allegedly took place in eastern Oklahoma during the mid-1850s. The story of the LaFleur County Bigfoot War is one that I've heard bits and pieces of through the years. So let's take a look at the story and see what we can find out. It's said that in or around 1855, a band of Choctaws in what is now Lafleur County and farmers in what is now Arkansas were experiencing some terrifying events. It all began in a rather benign way when the theft of vegetables, a few head of livestock, and other foodstuff by stealthy bandits in the night. The thieves were cagey, quiet, and never seen. They were also smart, as somehow they never ventured into Choctaw encampments on the nights when the watchman was in place. Neither did the bandits ever fall into the trap set for them by farmers outside of Indian Territory. Those charged with finding and capturing these marauders began to develop a begrudging respect for the wiliness of their adversaries as time went by and the petty thefts continued. While the thefts were annoying and did cause some hardships, neither the Choctaw or the neighboring Anglo farmers were afraid of the food bandits. However, things changed once women and children began to go missing. Spurred by reports of these kidnappings, a group of 30 Choctaw cavalrymen were organized to hunt down the abductors. The group was led by Joshua Lafleur, a man of mixed Choctaw and French blood who was deeply respected by his fellow tribesmen. Also joining the search party was a Choctaw warrior named Hamas Tubby and his 6 sons. The Tubbies were huge men, all approaching 7 feet in height and weighing in at more than 300 pounds each, and were regarded as fierce warriors and expert horsemen. The Tubbies were so effective in mounted warfare that despite their massive size, they became known as the Light Horsemen. This contingent of searchers, armed to the teeth, set out into the region known today as the McCurtain County Wilderness Area to search for the kidnappers. After riding all day, the searchers finally arrived in the area where they believed the bandits to be hiding. Lafleur brought his troops to a halt, stood up in his stirrups, and surveyed the area with a spyglass. It is unclear exactly what Lafleur saw, but whatever it was, he ordered his men to charge toward a stand of pines roughly 500 yards distant. Lafleur and the Tubby men led the attack. As the troops closed the distance between themselves and the stand of pines where the kidnappers were thought to be hiding, they were assaulted by a tremendous stench, the unmistakable odor of decay and decomposition. The horses of most of the men began to buck and rear, tossing their riders. Only the mounts of Lafleur and the Tubby men were disciplined enough to remain composed, allowing the 8 men to continue through the pines. As the men cleared the small wooded patch, they came upon a large earthen mound. Scattered across the mound were the bodies of children and women in various stages of decomposition. Lafleur and the Tubbies caught a glimpse of a number of the murderers fleeing into the tree line on the opposite side of the mound. Only 3 of the killers stood their ground to meet the charge of the Light Horsemen. It was at this time that the cavalrymen realized they were not going up against any human foe. Rather, standing before them, snarling and beating their chests, were 3 huge, hairy-covered creatures. Despite what must have been a shocking sight, Lafleur drew his pistol and saber, spurred his mount, and charged. As Lafleur approached the nearest ape, it took a mighty swipe and struck his horse in the head, killing it instantly. Lafleur managed to roll off the falling horse, quickly jumping to his feet, and fired multiple shots into the chest of the creature. Once his pistol was empty, Lafleur attacked the ape with his saber, opening up gaping wounds on the animal, which roared in rage and pain. Lafleur's assault on the creature was so quick, and the shock of seeing hair-covered monsters so great, that the Tubby men hesitated, completely stupefied, before entering the fray. This delay allowed one of the other 2 apes to get behind Lafleur, who was intensely focused on the ape he had engaged. The second beast grabbed Lafleur's head with 2 huge hands and ripped it from his shoulders. The horrible sight jolted the Tubby warriors into action, and they opened fire on the 3 Sasquatches with 50 caliber Sharps buffalo rifles. 2 of the beasts were killed instantly, dropping in their tracks. The third creature was wounded but turned and fled till the lethal shot could be fired. Robert Tubby, only 18 years old but already 6'11" and well over 300 pounds, spurred his horse, ran down the injured ape, and dispatched him with his hunting knife. As the rest of the troop, after gathering their panicked horses, joined them, the light horsemen surveyed the area. The bodies of dead women and children, mostly partially devoured, littered the area. The smell of decay, along with the terrible odor of the beast's feces, caused many of the men to vomit. After composing themselves, the men gathered the remains of the unfortunate women and children and buried them. They also buried their leader, Joshua LaFleur. As for the three ape-like monsters, their bodies were placed upon a huge bonfire and burned. Their hellish task complete, the Choctaw warriors returned to Tuskahoma, where it's said that the mighty Tubby men were plagued by terrible nightmares for years afterward. It's one hell of a story, but is any of it true? We do know that the Tubbies existed. So too did a man named Joshua LaFleur. You won't find any official documents that LaFleur died in battle. In fact, outside of the realm of folklore, there's virtually no information to establish that the LaFleur County Bigfoot War took place at all. Having said that, it is possible that the LaFleur County incident was actually based on a real event that took place in a different location. According to a Bigfoot researcher named Jim King, the answer might be yes. King believes the LaFleur County story is based on an event that took place much farther west in Kiowa territory, an event related to him by an Indian elder. According to the story, Kiowa women were placed in a special teepee or tent on the edge of the camp when they started their menstrual cycle. The women stayed there being tended to only by older women until their cycle was complete. The elder told King that women were considered unclean during their cycles, and Kiowa warriors were not only forbidden any physical contact with females during this time, they were not allowed to even look upon them. This seems a bit harsh, of course, but it's not too different than the way many cultures treated menstruating women in the past. The elder said that once long ago there had been trouble with ape-like creatures who were attracted by the scent and pheromones emanating from the tent where the menstruating women were housed. Since the tent was on the edge of the encampment, it proved to be an easy target for renegade apes who were said to have entered and carried off women on several occasions. To make a long story short, the Kiowa leadership decided that this was unacceptable and put together a group of warriors to hunt down the kidnappers. The searchers did manage to track an ape back to its lair and killed not only it, but the entire family unit. Could the LaFleur County story have its roots in the tale told to Jim King by the Kiowa elder? Is there any truth at all, even the smallest grains, in either tale? I've heard that many put their faith in the LaFleur County version simply due to the name of the unfortunate Joshua LaFleur. They wouldn't have named the county after him if it wasn't true, and other similar statements abound. I, however, have not been able to find anything saying LaFleur County was named after Joshua LaFleur. According to the Oklahoma Historical Society website, the name honors the prominent LaFleur family of the Choctaw Nation. Could Joshua LaFleur have been one of the prominent LaFleur family? It's certainly possible, but there does not seem to be any documentation singling out Joshua or his actions as the reason for the naming of the county. The story of the LaFleur County Bigfoot War, even if totally fictional, does seem to point to the fact that enormous hair-covered ape-like animals have been thought to reside in the region for a very long time, a time long before the Patterson-Gimlin film brought Bigfoot into America's consciousness. Add to this the beliefs of many other Native American tribes from across the North American continent, who have long told stories of these creatures snatching women and children, and the anecdotal evidence stack grows taller. Truth be told, the idea of child or a woman snatching Sasquatches continues to thrill, terrify, and enthrall us to this very day. It may very well be that the tale of the LaFleur County Bigfoot War was inspired by actual less dramatic events, like the Ape Canyon incident. Over the years, such a story would be embellished and grow to mythic proportions. It is all but inevitable, as a good scary story is irresistible. Don't be too hard on those who might have added to the original facts. After all, we all know that the most frightening types of campfire stories will always have one thing in common. They could really happen. I'm from Texas and have been living in Austin for about 10 years when I got this job doing healthcare in Round Rock, which was a smallish town north of Austin. This was in the early 90s, and although I've not been back, I'm very sure that this whole region has changed dramatically. I would do home visits with clients who lived throughout the area, not just in Round Rock. Some clients lived a bit far, maybe an hour or more away from the office. At the end of each day, I had to drop off files of the clients I worked with. Sometimes I worked until 9 or 10 at night. I had a lot to learn about getting around the area. I was not at all familiar with Round Rock, the roads and highways, and all of the small towns nearby. There was one thing I was told by my supervisors and coworkers right up front and repeatedly. Do not take Hairy Man Road, ever, but especially not at night. There are a lot of streets with crazy names in Texas, so I didn't think much of it, and I assumed that street was either in disrepair or had something like a bad blind spot or a difficult turn, etc. As time went by, I eventually asked a little bit more about Hairy Man Road, and I was told that it was a shortcut from one main road to the office, that it also cut a good 20 minutes or more off the trip to and from the office, but it was very narrow, and it went along a creek. I think it was called Brushy Creek. One person told me that there were stories of an actual hairy man living on or near that road. She told me that there were old stories of a child who got separated from her wagon train during the days when the Chisholm Trail was still used to drive cattle from Texas to Kansas, and that the boy became feral and killed animals for food, and sometimes killed people. She also said that some people thought that there were Bigfoot in the area, and that's the actual hairy man people have seen. I found that fascinating, but on a more practical level, I also learned that parts of Hairy Man Road were so narrow that only one vehicle would fit. Since most people in the area own trucks, I just put the idea of ever taking the Hairy Man Road shortcut completely out of my head. Until one day in the fall. One night, after a very long day working with clients and driving all over Central Texas, I realized that it was already 10 p.m. and I still had to drop off the files at the office. The first real cold front of fall was coming through, and after a typical, very long and super hot summer, I just wanted to get home and chill, literally chill, and relax outside in the much cooler weather. As I was driving back to the office, I came to turn onto Hairy Man Road. I hesitated because I knew better than to take that shortcut, but then I thought, how bad could it be? And this night in particular, I really just wanted to get work over with and get home. So I turned onto Hairy Man Road. And I quickly realized that, yes, this road is narrow and does go right along the creek. I mean, right along, butt up against it. I could see that it would be easy to drive off the road and into that damn creek. So yeah, that was troubling. Then I realized that there were no streetlights on this road. As I went further along the road, it became more like a small canyon, and that made the road even darker. There were rock walls on both sides that went up anywhere from a few feet to maybe 20 feet. And since the weather was changing, the temperature was dropping sharply. The cold air moving over the warm creek water was creating fog. As I went further into the canyon-like area, the smoky mist got much more dense and widespread. Of course, I had my headlights on high, but I could barely see. It got to the point that I must have been driving around 10 miles an hour at most, and I was scared that I would either drive into that creek or hit the rock wall, so I wasn't looking at my speedometer anymore anyway. I realized what a mistake it was to turn onto Hairy Man Road. I could barely see the road, and this was not the shortcut I was hoping for. Then I noticed something that looked like red or brown liquid shining on the road, which I thought must have been paint. Maybe a can of paint recently fallen off a truck. Then I noticed small things glistening in my headlights. I don't know how to describe them. Small rags soaked in red paint, maybe? Now, initially, I wasn't concerned about seeing these things. I didn't think it was strange until the small things got bigger and no longer looked like rags, but more like chunks of fresh meat. I was driving, or rather rolling even more slowly at this point, and I was trying to figure out what the hell I was looking at, until I saw what clearly seemed to be guts, intestines and organs, and then maybe even parts of arms and legs. And I was like, what the fuck? What happened here? I was so scared, but I kept driving. There was no way I was going to stop, because at this point, all I wanted to do was get the hell out of there and back to civilization. Then I saw what I instantly recognized as a rib cage. A goddamn rib cage, and I just about lost my mind. But I kept rolling, and as I rolled over it, I could hear the ribs cracking. I was beyond freaked out and frightened, and somehow kept going for what felt like an eternity. The road cleared up after the rib cage, but my mind was going wild with possibilities. Was that an animal or a person? Was that some kind of freak accident? Was someone's body dumped there? Was that a victim of hairy man? What the hell was it? I finally got back to a, quote, real road, and to the office where I dropped off the files and called the police. And well, that part of the story is long and boring. I'll just say that the official story the police eventually told me was that it was a deer that someone else hit with a vehicle. And I thought, really? What car or truck could mangle a deer like that? And on a road that you have to drive slow on? That was 10 kinds of bullshit. To this day, I'm convinced that the deer had been killed and eaten by a Bigfoot. Bottom line, if for whatever reason you find yourself in that part of Texas, stay the hell away from Hairy Man Road. You're listening to the Blackwater Media Radio Network, the finest in digital audio entertainment. This is Blackwater Media coming to you from the great city of Atlanta.
There are monsters everywhere. In Loch Ness, a 24-mile-long bottomless lake in the Highlands of Scotland, it's a creature known as the Loch Ness Monster. In the Himalayas, a towering mountain range on the Asian frontier, it's the monster known as the Abominable Snowman. And in the forests of America, a beautiful wilderness stretching for thousands of square miles, it's called Bigfoot. Now comes a motion picture that shows you actual footage of these and other monsters. You'll journey to Loch Ness and watch what happened when John Cobb, British speed champion, attempted to set a new record on water in 1955. Ignoring warnings about a monster living in the lake, Cobb takes his boat onto Loch Ness. Cobb was killed. His boat disintegrated. Next, you'll join a 1951 expedition to climb Mount Everest. After months of preparation, Eric Shipton led his band of experienced, cool-headed explorers up the treacherous mountain. Higher and higher they climbed. Then, standing at the 19,000-foot level, where no man had ever been before, they saw an incredible sight. Footprints. Giant, man-like tracks stretching out across the snow as far as the eye could see. The footprints of the Abominable Snowman. And closer to home, in Marietta, Washington, you will experience the terror of Bigfoot. It all began on the night of June 6th. Rita Graham was sitting on her couch watching TV. Suddenly, a giant, hairy hand crashed through the window and groped about. The monster was next seen by Tom Stern, and 3 days later in a Boy Scout camp. In all, the small town experienced 12 encounters within 30 days. Bigfoot, the abominable snowman, the Loch Ness Monster. Just 3 of the monsters you'll see in The Mysterious Monsters. A shocking look into man's encounters with the unknown. The Mysterious Monsters.
In the mid to late 1800s, settlers streamed west across North America in great numbers. There were various reasons for this exodus from the east. Gold was discovered in California. Land on the frontier was cheap, if not completely free. And the belief in manifest destiny had taken root deep in the American psyche. Texas was considered a prime location for refugees from the east. The climate was good and the soil fertile. Stephen F. Austin, Green DeWitt, Martin de Leon, and other impresarios secured land grants, first from Spain, later from Mexico, parceled the property, and sold it off in large tracts to eager settlers. Once Texas had become independent from Mexico, immigration increased dramatically. One area that attracted both Anglo and Native American settlers was in East Texas, in an area that today makes up Tyler and Polk counties. The reasons these pioneers chose this area west of the Sabine River were obvious to anyone who visited. The region was rich in timber and water resources. The land was good for farming, and the forest was teeming with all types of game. It was a virtual paradise. In the summer of 1846, something altogether new was introduced to the area's settlers: fear. This fear motivated the pioneers to reject the dog-run style cabins preferred in other parts of Texas and instead construct new homes of the thickest logs that resembled miniature forts. Students of Texas history might assume the source of this fear was tension between the settlers and the Native American tribes in the area. Such was not the case, as the dominant tribe of the area, the Alabamas, were presided over by a chief called Kalita, who generally preferred a peaceful, even friendly relationship with the white settlers. Despite the friendly relationship between the area's pioneers and the Alabamas, the settlers never felt completely comfortable with their Native American neighbors, and rumors of marauding Indians from the outer edges of Kalita's kingdom spread like wildfire from time to time. Kalita presided over the Alabamas, but also acted as chief over a loose affiliation of tribes that included the Cushatas, Creeks, and Kickapoos. When such rumors surfaced, settlers would appoint a family member to serve as a watchman, so that they would not be caught flat-footed by renegade Indians during the dark East Texas nights. It was during one of these times, when bands of marauding tribesmen were said to be in the area, that the legend of the Pebble Thrower of Peach Creek was born. The George Caudill family lived on Peach Creek, about a half-mile from the settlements called Peachtree Village. Having heard the rumors of roaming hostile Indians, George charged his 18-year-old son with taking the watch one hot night in August of 1846. The nervous youth began to hear movement sounds in the forest surrounding the family's cabin during the wee hours of the morning. The young Caudill could not see anything unusual in the dark woods, but continued to hear someone or something moving about. And suddenly an object of some kind struck the roof of the cabin. The teenager heard the object slowly roll down the eaves of the house and land on the sandy ground outside. Fearing this was some sort of Indian attempt to probe the cabin's defenses, the young man rushed to wake his father. Within minutes, the entire family was up and expecting the worst. A bit later, another small object struck the roof, rolled slowly down the sloped structure, and landed with a thump outside the cabin. This action was repeated multiple times throughout the night and was heard by the entire family. Mercifully, as the rays of dawn began to break through the towering trees of the East Texas forest, the activity ceased. Once it was fully daylight, the Caudills carefully stepped out of their cabin and inspected the area around the structure. The trees had long been cleared from the area immediately surrounding the home, making it impossible for anything to drop from them onto the roof. The front yard, as was the custom in those days, was kept grass and weed-free, and provided a sandy record of the tracks of any person or animal that visited the cabin. On that particular morning, there were no tracks of any kind. A search for the objects that struck the roof turned up nothing. The family was completely baffled. Around midday, George paid a visit to his nearest neighbors, a family by the name of Birchman. Cottle shared the story of the creepy goings-on of the previous night with his friend. Mr. Birchman replied, "That's funny. We had the same experience and about the same time. We couldn't find any tracks, but sure felt it was the Indians." The two men proceeded to the home of another neighbor, the Keyes family. They too reported having endured a barrage of pebbles during the previous night. Upon further inquiry, families up and down Peach Creek reported having experienced the shenanigans of the pebble thrower at some point in the recent past. Over time, the stone throwing continued. Annoyance replaced fear among the pioneers as it became clear that whoever the pebble thrower was, he was more prankster than marauder. All assumed that some mischievous Indian was the culprit, and it was decided a visit to Chief Kalita was in order, in the hopes that he could put a stop to the disturbing incidents. Upon hearing the testimony of the settlers, Kalita seemed strangely unsurprised and more than a little amused at the plight of the homesteaders. He stated that it was highly unlikely the pebble thrower was an Indian. He acknowledged there were probably a few unsavory characters among his tribal coalition, then added, "But the Indian does not poke fun at the white man. If he likes you, he'll not do that. If he does not like you, he has a better way of letting you know than throwing pebbles on the roofs of your homes." Kalita convinced the settlers that there was nothing he could do to stop the stone thrower, but there was likely nothing of which to be afraid. While the pioneers believed Kalita's assertion that Indians were not responsible, several left with the feeling that the chief knew more about what might actually be happening than he let on. Whatever the case, the rock throwing continued. Week after week, month after month, and year after year, the assault continued on the cabins of settlers up and down Peach Creek. The pebble thrower never left tracks, and the projectiles themselves were only rarely found. The pebble thrower of Peach Creek might have been a mischievous youth of native or Anglo origin. That would be the simplest and least disturbing explanation. It is worth mentioning, however, that the heavily forested regions of East Texas, West Louisiana, Southwest Arkansas, and Southeast Oklahoma have long traditions of wild man Sasquatch encounters. Two, Bigfoot lore is rife with incidents where these North American wood apes have reportedly hurled projectiles at or near people. The most famous example is no doubt the Ape Canyon incident that allegedly took place in the remote forests of Washington in 1924. However, literally hundreds of other projectile-throwing events have been documented over the years. Incidents that are eerily similar to those experienced by homesteaders along Peach Creek so long ago continue to be reported to this very day. Could the pebble thrower of Peach Creek have been a Sasquatch? Many would find such a hypothesis laughable. But as someone who has been holed up inside a cabin in a remote and heavily wooded location during such a barrage of rocks, I do not. If there's anything to the Bigfoot phenomena, the possibility should be considered. Should you ever find yourself awakened in the middle of the night by a loud impact on the roof of the cabin in which you're living or vacationing, you likely have nothing to fear other than the loss of a good night's sleep. However, I would recommend inspecting the roof of the structure the next morning. Should you find rocks resting there, you might reconsider your plans before staying a second night. After all, rocks cannot fly onto roofs, and they do not fall from trees. Did a Bigfoot really attack a party of men in the Okefenokee Swamp in 1829? Or was it all a tall tale? The answer to those questions, quite honestly, may never be known. But the story is one of many that add to the mystery of the swamp. The tale originated near the south end of Ware County, where the line that divides Georgia from Florida passes through the Okefenokee. In 1829, the first white settlers were just pushing into the fringes of the swamp. Surrounded by the stunning beauty of the swamp, they quickly picked up on an Indian legend that held a mysterious race of people lived on an island deep in the wilderness. So far as is known, another related account first appeared in print in 1806 in Jedediah Morse's book, Geography Made Easy. In his section on Georgia, Morse repeated a legend that a group of Indian hunters had gone into the swamp and become lost. When they were in a desperate condition, a party of the most beautiful women they'd ever seen came out to their rescue. Here's a quote from Morse's book. They being lost in inextricable swamps and bogs and on the point of perishing, were unexpectedly relieved by a company of beautiful women, whom they called daughters of the sun, who kindly gave them such provisions as they had with them, consisting of fruit and corn cakes. The tale, as repeated by Morse, continued with the women warning the hunters to flee as fast as possible to their own country, because their husbands were fierce men and cruel to strangers. These men of the swamp were said by the Creek Indians to be of gigantic stature and both cruel and warlike. The winter of 1828-1829 was extremely dry, and two men living on the edges of the swamp decided to explore as deep into it as they could. Accompanied by a boy, they went into the Okefenokee and over a course of 2 weeks continued to penetrate deeper and deeper into it. As they explored the very heart of the swamp, they made a startling discovery of gigantic footprints. The length of the foot was 18 and the breadth 9 inches. The monster, from every appearance, must have moved forward in an easy or hesitating gait, his stride from heel to toe being a trifle over 6 feet. This is what was printed in the Milledgeville, Georgia Statesman newspaper, January 1829. Published again in the Connecticut Sentinel, February 9, 1829. The men, as newspapers of the time noted, had, quote, seen enough. Ending their expedition and retreating out of the swamp, they related to their friends and neighbors what they'd seen. Of course, the story excited the curiosity of a party of hunters who lived just across the Florida line. 9 in number, they went into the swamps to find the mysterious giant, and they were guided by one of those members of the original party. Quote, following for some days the direction of their guide, they came at length upon the track first discovered, some vestiges of which were still remaining. Pursuing these traces several days longer, they came to a halt on a little eminence and determined to pitch their camp and refresh themselves for the day. The expedition was described in detail in newspaper reports published in February 1829. Those accounts indicated that as the hunters were discharging their guns to reload them with fresh powder for the night, a wild animal charged their camp. Here are actual details from the newspaper report. The next minute he was full in their view, advancing upon them with a terrible look and ferocious countenance. Our little band instinctively gathered close in a body and presented their rifles. The huge being, nothing daunted, bounded upon his victims, and in the same instant received the contents of 7 rifles. The fight, however, did not end there. He did not fall alone, as the newspaper reported, nor until he had glutted his wrath with the death of 5 of them, which he effectively by wringing the head from the body. Writhing and exhausted, at length he fell with his hapless prey beneath his grasp. As the creature lay dying on the ground, writhing and sometimes roaring, the men who survived the attack gathered round to make a closer inspection. The creature was found to measure 13 feet from head to toe, and its breadth and volume of just proportions. Immediately fearful that the dying monster's cries might attract others of its kind, the hunters fled the swamp. The men who died in the battle with the creature were left lying where they'd fallen. It's a damn remarkable story, but could it be true? The honest answer is that no one knows. The newspaper correspondent who reported it wrote that people living in Ware County on the margins of the Okefenokee Swamp clearly believed it. Either way, the story of the 1829 attack was one of the earliest written accounts of the creature we know today as Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Sightings of some kind of large creature in the swamp and discoveries of large footprints continue to be reported in that area to this very day. If you're from the Lone Star State, then you know that Davy Crockett is an important figure in Texas history. Although a native of Tennessee, Crockett left his home state after serving as a member of Congress when another individual was voted into his seat. This spawned his famous quote, "You all may go to hell, but I'm going to Texas." Although initially attracted to Texas by the allure of cheap land and natural resources, upon arriving, Crockett had many adventures which eventually led to him to advocate for Texas independence. He fought for the Texas Army in its quest to become its own nation free from the rule of Mexico, and Crockett famously died defending the Alamo. An avid outdoorsman, Crockett is mythologized for many of his skills as a woodsman, such as killing a bear with a knife when he was only 3 years old and wearing a coonskin cap. While some of these feats might be fantasies, there's plenty of evidence in Crockett's own journals and correspondence with friends and family that document his skill in the wild. One encounter that you may not know about is the time that Crockett allegedly came face to face with a Bigfoot. Upon traveling into the interior of Texas in what is close to the national forest that's named after him, Crockett wrote in a letter to his brother-in-law about an encounter he had with a creature that he described as the shape and shade of a large ape man. I want to now share with you the contents of Crockett's letter. William and I were pushing through some thicket, clearing the way when I sat down to mop my brow. I sat for a spell watching as Williams made his good and fine progress. I removed my boots and sat with my rations, thinking the afternoon a fine time to lunch. As the birds whistled and chirped, and I ate my small and meager ration, I tapped my axe upon the opposite end of a fallen tree I rested upon. The letter continues. Whether it was the axe's disturbance or possibly the heat of the sun which caused an apparition to slowly form in front of my eyes, I do not know. As a Christian man, I swear to you, Abe, that what spirit came upon me was the shape and shade of a large ape man, the likes we might expect among the more bellicose and hostile Indian tribes in the territories. The shade formed into the most deformed and ugly countenance, covered in wild hair, with small and needling eyes, large broken rows of teeth, and the height of 3 foundlings. I spit upon the ground the bread I was eating. Crockett continues. The monster then addressed a warning to me. Abner, it told me to return from Texas, to flee this fort, and to abandon this lost cause. When I began to question this, the creature spread upon the wind like the morning steam swirls off a frog pond. I swear to you, Abner, that whatever meat or sausage disagreed with me that afternoon, I swore off all beef and hog for a day or so afterward. Less than 6 months after the writing of this letter, Crockett was killed at the Alamo with approximately 190 others. Santa Anna's army swept north and east in an attempt to snuff out the Texas Revolution. That being the case, no clarification on the information in the letter was ever given. Most historians feel that the account in the letter was just an attempt by Crockett to entertain his brother-in-law. Some, however, feel differently. Many point to the fact that Crockett swore his account was true not once, but twice in the letter. They also point to how Crockett had insisted on changing the wording of the Oath of Allegiance as evidence that he took his honor seriously. The wording changed in the oath included the addition of the word Republican before the word government. That way, Crockett would have been obliged to defend a rogue government run by a non-elected dictator. It is this very change in the agreement that allowed Crockett to fight against Santa Anna with a clear conscience. Would Crockett have sworn the tale was true in writing if it didn't occur? Now, the entire matter of the creature apparition appearing and verbalizing a warning to Crockett is about as bizarre an incident as I've ever come across. Certainly the description of the creature given by Crockett matches the classic description of a wood ape or Sasquatch. The ugly countenance, covering of wild hair, and the small needling eyes described all sound familiar. So does the estimated height of 3 foundlings. Now, while there's no exact height of a foundling, a small abandoned child, most agree a safe estimate for this description would be somewhere between 7 and 8 feet. But that's where the similarities between Crockett's creature and credible modern Bigfoot accounts end. The claim of Crockett that the creature spoke to him and actually warned him to leave Texas is utterly unprecedented. I don't even know what to say about it. Crockett's description of how the apparition slowly formed and later disappeared, like the morning steam off a frog pond, makes the entire incident seem more likely to have been a lucid dream or hallucination of some kind. Again, it's all very strange. What did David Crockett see in the woods near Nacogdoches in 1836? The likelihood is that we will never know. Something telling, however, is how few people have heard of this account. So many of Crockett's feats and experiences have been trumpeted and blown up to mythic proportions through the years that it seems strange that this tale has fallen between the cracks and remains largely untold today. Having said that, though, maybe it isn't so strange after all. Americans like their heroes, especially those in the distant past, to be without blemish, perfect images chiseled into marble. These heroes, men like Crockett, are revered to this very day and held up as icons. The legacy of such a man might be tarnished if such a story leaked out and became well known. Better to dismiss the tale as nothing more than a bit of yarn spinning on the part of good old Davy, than to attempt to come to grips with the possibility that something genuinely strange happened in the deep woods of East Texas in 1836. Something very strange indeed. But still, there's something else here that deserves consideration. The creature we've come to call Bigfoot is undoubtedly a flesh and blood creature. After all, it leaves footprints, captures prey for food, and has been seen eating. There are even reports of the creature being injured and perhaps even killed by gunshots. However, none of this precludes the possibility of the existence of other types of beings, entities if you will, that have the ability to manifest and take on the likeness of a creature like Bigfoot. Such a being would have an etheric nature, appearing and vanishing at will, and perhaps even communicating telepathically. If Crockett's encounter is to be taken at face value, it is more likely that it was this type of being that he faced that day so long ago. Something to think about.